Stop the cameras! 3 words. That's all it took to kill a film set in Hong Kong. A film set with maybe 60 people on it, all of them moving a second before, all of them frozen the second after. 3 words, said quiet, said by a man who didn't have to say them twice, who in fact had never in his life said anything twice, because the kind of man who has to repeat himself is a man who isn't sure he'll be obeyed, and this man had not been unsure of being obeyed for a very long time. I've spent 30 years around rooms full of hard men, bro. I've stood in gyms where the air goes thick before 2 people decide to find out who's better. I know what that feels like in the chest, that drop, that tightening, the way your own heartbeat suddenly gets loud in your ears. And everyone who was on that set in Hong Kong, on that hot afternoon in the early 70s, told the same part of the story the same way, no matter how much else they got wrong or remembered different. They all said the same thing about the moment those 3 words landed. They said the lights kept humming. That's the detail. The big cinema lamps, the ones they used back then, the hot tungsten ones that put out a sound like a low electric breath, those kept going. And in a set that had gone dead silent, that hum was suddenly the loudest thing in the world. 60 people not breathing, and over all of them, that low electric hum, like the room itself was holding one long note while it waited to see what would happen. The man who said the 3 words owned a piece of that city. Not a building. A piece. Of the streets. Of who walked safe and who didn't, of which businesses opened in the morning, and which ones found their windows broken, of where the money flowed at night, and who took a cut of it on the way through. He didn't carry a weapon that anybody could see, because men like that don't need to. The weapon was the 4 men who came in behind him, and spread out along the edges of the room without being told. The weapon was the way the production manager went the color of paper. The weapon was the silence itself, which the man in the dark suit had brought into the room the way another man might bring in a smell of smoke. He had come to shut the whole thing down. The movie, the production, all of it. There was money owed, or money demanded, or a line that somebody on the production had crossed without meaning to. The stories don't agree on exactly what, and honestly the exactly what doesn't matter, because with men like this the exactly what is never really the point. The point is the reminder. The point is that everybody in that room remembers, for the rest of their lives, who is allowed to say, "Stop the cameras," and have the cameras stop. And the cameras stopped. The clapperboard, you know the thing? The black and white striped board they snapped shut at the start of a take. It was in a young assistant's hands, halfway up, and that kid told the story years later and said he just froze with it held up in the air, both hands, didn't dare bring it down, didn't dare lower it, because lowering it felt like a movement and movement felt dangerous. So he just held it there, this stupid wooden board up in the air, his arms starting to ache, while the most powerful man he'd ever been within 50 feet of stood in the doorway and let the silence do its work. 60 people, 1 door, 1 man in the door, and 4 along the walls. And that humming. Now, here's the thing you have to understand before I tell you what happened next, because if you don't understand this part, the rest of it won't hit you the way it hit every single person who was actually there. The smallest man on that set, the one nobody in the doorway was even looking at, the one standing off near the camera in a plain dark shirt with sweat on him from a morning of takes, that man set down what he was holding, and he started walking toward the door. Alone. No one with him. No one beside him. The crew didn't move because the crew couldn't move, and even if they could have, not one of them would have walked toward that door, because walking toward that door was the single most dangerous thing a person could do in Hong Kong that afternoon. And the smallest man on the set did it anyway, walked across that open stretch of concrete floor between the camera and the door, walked into all that silence and all that humming, walked straight at the man who owned a piece of the city. What happened in the next few minutes? And it was only a few minutes, bro. The whole thing was over fast, the way the realest things always are. What happened in those few minutes is the reason I drove a lot of miles and bought a lot of coffee for a lot of old men to get this story right. Because there was no fight. I'll tell you that now, so you're not waiting for it. Nobody threw a punch. Nobody got hit. There's no knockout in this one. And it's still the most dangerous thing I've ever heard described. Stick around. Because here's what you need to know going in. Nobody on that set ever told this story the same way twice, and no two of them told it the same way as each other, but every last one of them remembered the silence, and every last one of them remembered who walked toward the door, and that's how I knew the bones of it were true even when the meat kept changing. I want to tell you how this story even reached me, because it matters, and because the man who carried it to me was a particular kind of man, and you should know who he was before you trust a word that came through him. He was a journalist. Hong Kong, born and raised, the son of a Hong Kong newspaperman before him, which means the truth was a family trait going back further than most of us can claim for anything. He spent his working life on the entertainment beat in the years when Hong Kong cinema was exploding into something the whole world would eventually be watching. And that beat in that city in those years meant something very specific that it doesn't mean here. It meant you couldn't write about the movies without writing around the men who funded them. And a lot of the men who funded them were not the kind of men whose names you put in a newspaper if you wanted to keep writing newspapers. He learned to see everything and print half of it. That's the trade in a city like that, in years like those. You see all of it, and you carry most of it, and you print the part that won't get the presses smashed. The rest you keep. You keep it in your head, and the older you get the heavier it gets, until one day you're an old man and a foreigner buys you tea and asks the right question quietly enough, and it all comes out, because the thing you've carried for 40 years gets tired of being carried. He was on that set. Not for the whole shoot. He came and went, the way reporters do, but he happened to be there that afternoon, standing near the back with a notebook he never opened, because some part of him knew the second the door darkened that whatever was about to happen was not the kind of thing you write down while it's happening. You write it down after, if you live to. So when I tell you what happened in that room, understand that it comes through one man's eyes, an old man's memory of a young man's afternoon, filtered through 40 years of a city that taught him to see clearly and say carefully. He's gone now. He told me this near the end, in a small flat with the windows open and the city noise coming up from below, and he told it slow, and a couple of times he stopped and looked out the window for a while before he kept going, and I let him, because some stories need the looking out the window in the middle of them, or they don't come out whole. He said to me, early on, before he told me anything, "You have to understand what that man in the doorway was. The Westerners who hear this story, they think gangster, and they think of a movie. A man with a cigar. A man who shouts." And he shook his head. No, the dangerous ones don't shout. The dangerous ones make the room so quiet you can hear the lights. And he was right, and you'll hear me come back to that, because it's the whole spine of this thing. There were two men in that room who understood that the loud ones aren't the dangerous ones, and the entire few minutes that followed was those two men recognizing that about each other. I'm going to set the table now. The city, the business, what it actually meant in that place at that time for a man like the one in the doorway to walk onto a film set and say, "Stop the cameras." Because if you only see it through Western eyes, you'll undercount it. And if you undercount it, you'll undercount what the small man did when he set down what he was holding and walked toward the door alone. Hong Kong in the early 70s was two cities stacked on top of each other and pretending to be one. The top city was the one that made the movies. It was bright and loud and getting richer by the month, full of ambition and talent and people who'd come from nothing and were clawing their way up through an industry that was inventing itself as fast as they could run. The Kung Fu pictures were starting to find an audience that reached way past the harbor, way past the mainland, all the way around the world, though most of the people making them didn't fully grasp that yet. There was money coming in. Where there's money coming in, there's a question of who controls it. And that question is where the second city lived. The second city was underneath. It didn't make movies. It made sure the movies paid. It moved through the streets at night, and along the docks and through the back rooms of the places where business actually got decided. And it had been doing this so long and so thoroughly that most people in the top city had stopped thinking of it as a separate thing at all. It was just how things worked. You wanted to shoot a scene on a particular street. You didn't only talk to the police. You talked to whoever the street belonged to in the way that mattered, and you came to an arrangement, and the arrangement had a price, and the price got paid, and the cameras rolled. That was normal. That was Tuesday. The men who ran the second city were not, most of them, the snarling villains of the pictures the top city was busy cranking out. That was the journalist's whole point to me, the thing he kept circling back to. The real ones were quiet. The real ones were businessmen, in their own way, patient, careful, deeply concerned with the appearance of respect, because respect was the currency the whole operation ran on. A man like the one in the doorway didn't keep his piece of the city by hurting people all day long. He kept it by being the kind of man who could, and by everybody knowing it, and by very rarely having to prove it. The proving was a failure, in a sense. Every time he had to actually make an example of someone, it meant the fear had thinned out somewhere and needed topping up. The ideal, for a man like that, was a city so thoroughly convinced of what he could do that he never had to do anything at all. You see why he walked onto that set himself, then. You'd think a man at his level sends people. And usually he did. The fact that he came in person, the fact that he stood in that doorway with his own 2 feet on that concrete, told everyone in the room something specific. This matters to me, and I am choosing to spend my own presence on it, which means the answer is already decided, and I am only here to watch it land. He didn't come to negotiate. He came to be witnessed. He came so that 60 people would carry the memory out of that room and into the industry, so the story would spread the way the journalist's stories spread, person to person, quiet, and the fear would top itself up for another year without him having to lift a hand. That was the plan. That was always the plan with a man like that. And it was a good plan. It had worked 100 times. It would have worked that afternoon, too, on any film set in Hong Kong, with any cast and any crew, because the math of it was airtight. One man's reputation against 60 people's instinct for self-preservation, and self-preservation wins that one every single time. It isn't even close. You do not walk toward the door. But there was a variable on that particular set that the man in the doorway had not fully priced in. And I don't think he could have. I don't think anyone could have, in that city, in those years, because the variable was so far outside the normal math that it didn't even register as a factor. The variable was that the smallest man on the set, the one in the plain dark shirt, was a man who had spent his entire life refusing, down in the deepest part of himself, with everything he had, to be afraid in exactly the way the man in the doorway needed him to be afraid. The journalist said it to me like this. He said, "Every other man in that room did the arithmetic. One frightening man, for more along the walls, a whole city behind them. You weigh that against your one life, and you stand still." That is not cowardice. That is arithmetic. Every man in that room did the arithmetic and got the right answer and stood still. And then he looked out the window for a while, the way he did, and when he turned back he said, "Except one." And the one did not do the arithmetic at all, because for him it was not a math problem. It was a question of who he was, and he already knew who he was. I want to sit on that with you for a second, bro, because it's the hinge the whole story turns on, and I don't want you to blow past it. 60 people did the math. The math said stand still. The math was correct. Standing still was the smart move, the safe move, the move I'd probably tell my own students to make if they came to me and asked. There is no shame in the 60. Put me in that room at 25 years old, and maybe I'm one of the 60. The 60 were sane. But there's a kind of man, every so often, who doesn't run his life on that math. Not because he's reckless. Not because he doesn't understand the danger. He understands it better than anyone. That's the whole thing. He runs his life on a different question entirely, a question that sits underneath the math and doesn't care about the math. And the question is, what kind of man am I when it counts? And he had answered that question so completely, so many times, in so many smaller moments that nobody ever saw, that by the time he was standing on that set with the door gone dark, the answer was already loaded. He didn't have to decide anything. The deciding was done years ago. All that was left was the walking. So he set down what he was holding, and he walked toward the door. Let me tell you about him now. The small one. He wasn't the star, the way you'd think about a star, or rather he was, but not in the room, not to the men in the doorway, not in the way that would have protected him. To the boss, he was a face on a poster maybe, an actor, a performer, one of the bright loud people from the top city who made the pictures, and didn't understand how the real machinery worked underneath. That's how the boss would have clocked him, if he clocked him at all in those first seconds. An entertainer. A small one, physically, and the boss was not a small man. None of the 5 of them were small men. They were the kind of men who take up doorways. So you've got this physical picture that's almost comic if it weren't so frightening. 5 large men by the door and the walls, and one lean compact fellow in a sweated-through shirt walking toward them across an empty floor. But here's what the boss couldn't see, and here's what the crew couldn't see either. Not really, not the way I want you to see it. The small man had spent his whole life, every year of it, every single year going back to when he was a skinny kid getting into scraps on these very same Hong Kong streets, preparing his body and his nerve for exactly one thing. Not for fighting, exactly. For the moment before fighting. For the moment where everything hangs and nothing's been decided, and the whole weight of what might happen sits in the air between 2 people. He had trained that moment 10,000 times. He had trained it more than he trained any punch or any kick, because he understood something that the boss also understood, something the journalist kept hammering at me. The real contest is almost never the fight. The real contest is the moment before, the measuring, the question of who believes what about whom. Win that, and the fight usually never happens. Lose that, and you've already lost before a hand moves. 2 men in that room understood this. That's what made it the story it is. The boss had built an empire on the moment before, on fear, on presence, on making rooms go quiet. And the small man had built a body and a mind and an entire philosophy on the very same ground, from the opposite direction. The boss used the moment before to make people small. The small man used it to refuse to be made small. They were, in a strange way, the 2 greatest living experts in the same exact thing, and they had never met until now. And now they were walking toward each other across 60 feet of silent concrete with the lights humming. I've thought about that a lot, bro. 2 masters of the same art. Only one of them did it with a criminal empire behind him, and the other did it with nothing behind him but who he decided to be. And the second kind scares the first kind more than any weapon, and I'll tell you why before we're done. The small man walked slow. The journalist was very clear about that, and it's the kind of detail you can't invent, because it's not what you'd guess. You'd guess he came on fast, full of nerve, getting it over with. No. He walked slow, easy, unhurried, like a man crossing his own living room. And the slowness was its own message, the first thing the small man said before he said anything with his mouth, and the message was, I am not afraid, and I have all the time in the world, and your silence does not press on me the way it presses on everyone else. Every step at that easy pace, across all that quiet, while 60 people held their breath, peeled a little something off the moment that the boss had built. Because the boss's whole power in that instant was the silence, was the pressure of it, was the way it made people freeze. And here came a small man strolling through that pressure like it was a warm afternoon, taking his time, in no rush at all. By the time he was halfway across the floor, the journalist said, something had already shifted, though no one could have named it yet. The 4 men along the walls had been still and easy themselves, bored almost, the relaxed stillness of dangerous men who don't expect to be needed. And somewhere in that slow walk, the journalist watched one of them, just one, at first, change his stillness. It got tighter, got ready. The bored stillness became the other kind, the kind with weight behind the knees, and the journalist, who had spent his life learning to read exactly these rooms, knew what that meant. It meant that one of the 4 had stopped seeing an entertainer and started seeing something he didn't have a category for, and his body had reacted before his mind caught up. His body had said, this one is different. And the body always knows first. I've taught that to students for 30 years, and it's the truest thing I know. The body always knows first, and the trained body knows soonest of all. And one of those 4 men had a very trained body, and it had just told him to get ready. The boss had not moved. The boss stood in his doorway with a late light behind him, and he watched the small man come, and his face. The journalist spent a long time trying to describe his face to me, and kept not being satisfied, and finally landed on this. It was the face of a man reading a document he expected to be simple, and finding a clause he did not write. That's good. That's exactly it. The boss had walked in with the whole afternoon already scripted in his head. The set freezes, somebody important grovels, the price gets set, he leaves, the fear tops up. Simple document. And now here was a clause walking across the floor toward him that he had not written and did not recognize, And a man like that, a man whose entire power rests on nothing ever surprising him, does not like an unrecognized clause. It is the most dangerous thing in his world. Not a gun. A surprise. Because his power is the appearance of total control, and a surprise is a crack in the appearance, and a crack is where everything eventually breaks. The small man stopped. A few feet away. Close enough to talk quiet. Far enough that nothing had been declared. And the two of them stood there in the humming light, the small man and the boss, with 4 hard men along the walls and 60 held breaths behind, and for a moment, the journalist swore this. For a moment, nobody and nothing in that entire room made a sound, not even the shuffle of a foot, not even the creak of a light stand, nothing, just the hum, just those two faces. Just the few feet of air between them that now held the entire weight of everything. And then the small man did the thing that the journalist said he would never forget, not if he lived another 100 years. The small man smiled. I'm going to stop right there, bro. Right on the smile. Because what that smile was, and what it did, and what the boss did back, and how a few minutes of 2 men standing close in a humming room ended a confrontation that should by every law of that city have ended in blood or in money. That's the heart of this thing, and it deserves its own telling, slow, the way the journalist gave it to me with the windows open and the city coming up from below. So pour yourself something. Settle in. Because the small man just smiled at the most dangerous man in Hong Kong, and the most dangerous man in Hong Kong had no idea yet what that smile was going to cost him. The small man smiled. Now I need you to understand what kind of smile, because there's about 10 kinds, and 9 of them would have gotten him killed. It wasn't a nervous smile. A nervous smile, the boss would have read in half a heartbeat. He'd seen 10,000 nervous smiles. They were practically his trade, the little frightened upturn of the mouth that men make when they're trying to seem friendly to the thing that's going to hurt them. That smile feeds a man like the boss. That smile is dinner. If the small man had given him that smile, the whole afternoon snaps back onto its rails, and the document reads simple again. It wasn't a mocking smile either. A mocking smile, a smirk, a here's what I think of you sneer, that would have been a declaration, and a declaration in that room with those 4 men along the walls is a thing you don't walk back from, and the small man wasn't there to declare anything. A mocking smile is loud. And we've established, haven't we, that the loud ones aren't the dangerous ones. The small man wasn't loud. The journalist worked at describing it to me for a long time, and what he finally settled on has stayed with me for years. He said, "It was the smile of a man greeting someone he had been hoping to meet." Sit with that, because that's a terrifying thing to put on your face in front of a man who has come to frighten you. The small man looked at the boss. This man who controlled streets through fear, this man before whom 60 grown adults had just stopped breathing, and he smiled at him the way you smile at someone you've heard a great deal about and are genuinely pleased to finally see in the flesh. Warm, curious, almost glad, as if the boss had done him a small kindness by showing up. As if the most natural thing in the world had just occurred. And that, bro, is a move so far off the boss's map that for a second, and the journalist swears he saw this, swears it on his father's name, for a single second, the boss's own face did something it had not been told to do. The corner of his mouth. It moved, not into a smile, into confusion, and then back fast, locked down again behind the stone, but it moved, and the journalist caught it, and that flicker is the first crack I promised you. That flicker is the moment the document got a clause in it that the boss could not read. Because here's the mechanics of it, and I'll keep it clean because we save the full breakdown for the end. Fear is a transaction. It only works if both parties agree to the terms. The frightening man offers fear, and the frightened man accepts it, and the deal closes, and now there's a powerful one and a small one, and everybody knows their place. That's the deal the boss had come to close. 60 times closed before. Easy money. But a transaction needs 2 signatures. And the small man, with that one warm, curious, glad little smile, had just declined to sign. Politely. Pleasantly. Without a single word. He'd looked at the offered fear, and he'd smiled, and he had simply, gently, not picked it up. And there is nothing, a man whose entire empire is built on that transaction can do about a man who won't sign. He can escalate to violence, sure. But violence is the failure state, remember? Violence means the fear didn't take, means he has to spend the expensive thing, the bloody thing, the thing that brings police and attention and consequences even for a man like him. The whole art of his trade was getting the signature without the violence. And he'd just met a man who, with one smile, had shown him the signature was not coming, and had done it so quietly and so pleasantly that there was nothing yet to even push against. You can't hit a smile. You can't threaten a man who looks delighted to see you. Well, you can, but the second you do, you've admitted the smile beats you, you've admitted you had to spend the blood, and a man at his level felt it in his gut, the way the journalist's body had felt the room change. So the boss did the only thing left to him. He spoke. He spoke, and the journalist couldn't give me the exact words, and I want to be honest with you about that, because I could make some up that sound good and you'd never know. But that's not the trade I'm in, and it's not the trade the journalist was in either. He couldn't hear them. He was too far back, the words were too low, and the few that carried were in a register of Cantonese. The journalist called it the old register, the formal one, the one men used precisely when they wanted to wrap a threat in courtesy, that he caught the shape of but not the content. So I won't invent the lines. I'll tell you what he could tell me, which is better anyway, because it's true. He could tell me the music of it, the way it sounded, the shape of the exchange, even where he'd lost the words. And the music went like this. The boss spoke first, and it was short, and it was low, and it had that rapt courtesy thing the journalist described, the velvet over the iron. A few sentences. The kind of thing that on paper might read like a polite inquiry, and in the room meant do you understand who I am, and what I can do, and what is about to happen to everything you built here. And the 4 men along the walls, the journalist said, settled deeper into their readiness while the boss spoke, the way a backing band settles in behind a singer. The boss's words and the 4 men's stillness were one instrument. Threat in stereo. And the small man listened. That's the next thing the journalist underlined for me, and it's a thing almost nobody understands about real presence, real command. The small man listened. He didn't talk over it. He didn't get his answer ready while the boss was still going, the way nervous men do, the way men do when they're scared, jamming their response into the gaps because the silence frightens them. The small man let the boss finish. Let every word land. Stood there in that easy, unhurried way, head tilted just slightly, with that warm, curious look still on him, and gave the boss the gift, and it is a gift, and the boss would have known it was a gift, which is exactly why it landed like a slap. The gift of his complete, unhurried, unintimidated attention. You want to know what real power looks like, bro? It's not the man who can make you go quiet. It's the man who can make you feel listened to while you threaten him. Because the first man controls the room through fear, and fear is loud, and fear is expensive, and fear leads away and has to be topped up. But the second man controls the room through something the first man can't buy and can't break, and we'll name it before we're through, but watch it work first. When the boss finished, there was a pause. The small man let the pause sit, didn't rush to fill it. And the journalist said the pause was its own answer before the small man ever opened his mouth, because a frightened man can't tolerate a pause. A frightened man fills it instantly, and the small man let it stretch out comfortable and easy like he was deciding what tea to order. Then he spoke. And again, I don't have the words, but the journalist had the music, and the music of the small man's reply was the thing that turned the whole afternoon. So listen close. It was short, too. Shorter than the boss's. And it was quiet, quieter, even, than the boss had been, so quiet the journalist had to read it off the faces of the men who could hear it rather than his own ears. And whatever it was said with that same warmth, that same ease, no edge in it, no threat in it that anyone could point to and call a threat. The journalist said it sounded almost kind. And here's the part. When the small man finished his few quiet words, the boss did not answer right away. The boss, who had not been made to pause by anyone in years, paused. And one of the four men along the wall, the same one, the journalist thought, whose stillness had gone tight earlier, that one's eyes moved. Flicked to the boss. Just a flick. Checking. The way a soldier checks his commander when something has gone slightly off the plan, and he wants to know whether the plan is still the plan. And that flick, bro, that tiny flick of a dangerous man's eyes toward his boss for reassurance, that was the second crack, and it was bigger than the first, because the first crack was on the boss's own face where he could hide it, and this one was on the face of his man, out in the open, where the whole structure of who's in charge here lived. I want to step back from the room for a minute, because you need to understand what the small man was actually doing, and it wasn't magic, and it wasn't luck, and it wasn't because he was secretly going to whip out some lightning technique and drop 5 men. He wasn't. He had no intention of fighting, and he knew, better than anyone in that room, that fighting was the worst possible outcome for him. 1 man against 5, with a whole criminal organization behind them, and a whole city behind that. If it came to hands, he might take 2 of them, even 3. The journalist and I agreed on that much. He was that good. But 3 out of 5 with the rest of that world behind them is not a fight you win. It's a fight you survive at best, if you're lucky, and survive into a future where you and everyone you love now lives under a sentence. The small man knew that. He was not a reckless man. People think a man with that kind of courage must be reckless, must not really understand the danger. It's backwards. He understood the danger completely. That's where the courage came from. Reckless men aren't brave. They just can't see the cliff. The small man saw the whole cliff, every foot of the drop, and walked the edge anyway because he decided long ago what kind of man walks edges. So if he wasn't going to fight, and he wasn't going to grovel, what was he doing? He was offering the boss a door. That's the thing the journalist made me understand over about 3 cups of tea, the thing that took me longest to really get in my bones. The small man had read the situation faster and deeper than anyone, and he'd seen the trap the boss was actually in. A trap the boss couldn't see because he was inside it. The boss had walked into that room to close the fear transaction in front of 60 witnesses. He needed the small man or someone to sign. But the moment the small man declined to sign, with the smile, with the listening, with the easy quiet, the boss was stuck. Because now the boss had only two ways out, and both were bad. He could escalate to violence in front of 60 witnesses, spin the blood, bring the heat, and worst of all, reveal that a small man had forced him to, reveal that the fear hadn't worked, which is the one thing he could never afford to reveal, because his whole empire was the belief that the fear always works. Or he could back down, and backing down in front of 60 witnesses was its own death, the slow kind, the kind where the story spreads the wrong direction and the fear tops up in reverse. Both doors led to the boss losing. The small man had, in about 90 seconds and one smile and a few quiet words, walked the boss into a room with only losing exits. That's what the tight stillness and the flicking eyes were about. At least one of those four men was good enough to feel the trap closing too, to sense that his boss had somehow ended up on the back foot against an unarmed entertainer, and not to understand how, which is the most unsettling thing of all for a man like that. But here's where the small man was different from a man who just wants to win. A man who just wants to win, having walked the boss into that trap, springs it, humiliates him, lets him twist, and gets himself and everyone he loves killed inside a month. Because you do not trap a man like that publicly and let him feel it and then go home and sleep. The city doesn't work that way. The boss cannot allow that story to exist and will spend any amount of blood to erase it. The small man didn't spring the trap. He showed the boss the trap, quietly, privately, in those few feet of close air where only the boss could really see it, and then, in the same breath, he built the boss a third door. A way out that wasn't violence and wasn't backing down. A door that let the boss walk out of that room with everything he'd come in with. His face, his power, his story intact, the fear undisturbed. The small man handed the most dangerous man in Hong Kong a way to leave as the man he'd walked in as, and the price of that door, the only price, was that the boss leave. Just leave. Let the cameras roll. Walk back out the way he came, and let the whole thing be, in the official version that 60 people would carry out, something other than what it actually was. That's what the few quiet kind words were, the journalist believed. Not a threat. Not a plea. An offer. The small man, in effect, and I'm putting words to it that the journalist only ever put to it in shapes and music, the small man said something like, I see exactly where you are, and I'm not going to put you there in front of these people. Here's how we both walk out of this hole. You first. And do you understand what that is, bro? Do you understand what kind of man does that? The small man had the boss beaten. Truly beaten in the only contest that mattered, the moment before contest, the who believes what contest. He'd won it. And instead of taking the win, instead of doing what almost any man would do with a beaten enemy, which is enjoy it, he spent his win buying the loser away to leave with dignity. He gave away the thing he'd just earned. Because he understood, the way only a very few people in this life ever understand, that the goal was never to beat the boss. The goal was to keep the cameras rolling and keep 60 people alive and unharmed and walk everyone, including the boss, out of that room in one piece. Winning wasn't the point. Winning was just the tool. The point was that everybody got to go home. I've thought about that more than almost anything else in this whole story. We train our whole lives, those of us in the fighting trades, to win, to beat the other man. And here's a man at the absolute peak of that art who understood that the highest use of winning is to be able to give it back, to be so completely in command of a deadly moment that you can afford to let the other man keep his pride, because your pride was never what was on the table. Only the lives were. Only the cameras. Only everybody going home. The boss did not take the third door right away. Of course he didn't. A man doesn't reverse 20 years of how the world works in 4 seconds because a small man was gracious to him. There was a stretch in there. The journalist couldn't say how long time does strange things in rooms like that. He guessed maybe a dozen seconds and admitted it might have been 3 or might have been 30, where the thing hung genuinely undecided. Where the boss stood in his doorway and looked at the small man, and you could see, the journalist said, the actual machinery working behind his eyes, weighing it. The blood door, the backing down door, and this strange third door the small man had just built and was holding open for him, quiet, unhurried, with that same warm look like none of it was any trouble at all. And the 4 men along the walls felt the undecidedness, and it changed them. The journalist watched all 4 of them, now, sink into the tight readiness, no more boredom anywhere in the room, for dangerous bodies loaded and waiting on a word or a look from the boss, the word or look that would mean take him. They were waiting for it. They were ready for it. The whole room was a wire pulled to its limit, and the only question left in the world was which way the boss would let it snap. And the small man stood in front of all 5 of them, alone, unarmed, in his sweated shirt, and the journalist said this last part very quietly, in his flat, with the city coming up through the window. The small man never stopped looking only at the boss. Never once glanced at the 4 men on the walls. Never checked the exits. Never let his eyes do the frightened thing, the darting thing, the calculating the threats thing that every other body in that room was doing. He kept his eyes on the boss, soft and steady and warm, as if the 4 men did not exist, as if there were only 2 people in the entire world, and they were having a private and rather pleasant conversation. And the journalist said that was the thing that decided it. Not the smile, not the words, not the trap. That. The small man's refusal to look at the 4 men was the final, total proof of the offer he'd made. Because a man planning violence watches the threats. A man who's afraid watches the exits. A man who is lying to you about wanting peace can't help but check the angles. And the small man checked nothing, watched nothing, defended nothing. He just stood there giving the boss his whole calm attention, which was itself the message, the unfakeable message. I meant it. The door is real. I'm not going to spring anything. Walk through it, and we're done, and everybody goes home, and the story stays whatever you need it to be. You cannot fake that, bro. I've watched men try to fake calm in front of danger for 30 years, and you cannot fake it, not to anyone who knows how to look, and the boss knew how to look. The boss had spent his whole life learning how to look. He looked at the small man not watching the 4 killers in the room, and he understood, finally, completely, what he was dealing with. Not an entertainer. Not a fool. Not a reckless man who didn't grasp the danger. He was dealing with a man who grasped the danger more completely than the boss did, who had seen the whole board including the squares the boss couldn't see, and who had, out of something the boss may not even have had a word for, chosen to use that total understanding not to destroy him, but to spare him. That's a thing a man like the boss almost never encounters. Mercy from a position of strength. Real mercy, not the weak kind, not the begging kind, but the kind that comes from someone who could hurt you and chooses not to and asks nothing for it, but that you leave. The boss dealt in the opposite of that every day of his life. His whole world ran on strength taking what it could and mercy being weakness. And here was the strong move and the merciful move turning out to be the same move, embodied in a small calm man who would not even do him the insult of watching his bodyguards. I'm going to leave you right there, in the undecided dozen seconds, with 4 killers loaded and the boss's machinery turning behind his eyes, and the small man watching only him, warm and easy, holding the 3rd door open. Because what the boss did next, the exact thing, the small specific physical thing he did that told the whole room which door he'd chosen, is the moment the journalist carried for 40 years and looked out the window before he could say, and it deserves to land on you clean, in its own telling, with nothing crowded around it. So take a breath. The lights are still humming. Nobody's moved. And the most dangerous man in Hong Kong is about to decide, in front of 60 witnesses, whether to be the man he walked in as, or something else. The boss bowed his head. That's it. That's the whole thing. After everything, after the silence, and the 4 men and the trap and the 3rd door, and the dozen hanging seconds, the most dangerous man in Hong Kong tipped his head forward, maybe an inch, maybe 2. A small motion. The smallest motion. The kind of thing you'd miss entirely if you weren't watching, and everybody was watching, so nobody missed it. But I need you to understand what an inch of a man's head can mean, in the right room, at the right moment, in the right culture, because in our world, here we'd barely register it, and in that room it was an earthquake. A bow, even a tiny one, even just the head, is the language the whole second city ran on. Respect, deference, who acknowledges whom. It is the physical grammar of the entire system the boss had spent his life inside. And in that grammar, the man who lowers his head is the man who yields the higher position. Not always in surrender, sometimes in courtesy, sometimes in respect between equals, but always, always in acknowledgement. The boss had walked into that room as the man before whom others lowered their heads. That was the entire transaction he came to close. 60 people, heads down, eyes down, fear accepted, signature on the line. And instead, he was the one who lowered his. To a small man in a sweated shirt, in front of 60 witnesses. Now, and this is the genius of it, this is why I told you the small man hadn't sprung the trap, but had built a 3rd door. The bout could be read 2 ways, and the small man had set it up so it could be read 2 ways on purpose, and the boss knew it could be read 2 ways, and that's exactly why the boss could do it. To the 4 men along the walls, to the 60 crew, in the official story that would walk out of that room, the bout could be read as a great man's grace. A powerful man, secure in his power, acknowledging a worthy man. A nod between 2 figures of consequence. Magnanimous. Even flattering to the boss, in a certain telling, see how secure he is, that he can offer respect and lose nothing. That was the version the small man's 3rd door made available. That was the face the boss got to keep. But underneath, in the few feet of close air where only the 2 of them really lived, both men knew what it actually was. It was the white flag. It was the boss accepting the door. It was the most powerful man in the room conceding, to the one person who'd seen the whole board, that he'd been beaten in the only contest that counted, and that he was grateful to have been given a way to lose that looked, to everyone else, like winning. The small man bowed back. And this is where the journalist, in his flat, with the windows open, stopped and looked out at the city for a long time before he could go on. The small man bowed back, the journalist said, and he bowed lower. Lower than the boss had. Deeper. More respect than he'd been given, returned with interest. And do you understand what that did, bro? Do you see it? The small man had the boss beaten, had built him a door, had watched him walk through it, and at the very last instant, with one deeper bow, the small man handed the official story its final, perfect shape. Because now, to the 60 witnesses, to the 4 men on the walls, it didn't even look like the boss had yielded. It looked like 2 great men had exchanged respect, and the smaller one had shown the greater the deeper courtesy. The small man, with that lower bow, didn't just give the boss the 3rd door. He swept the floor in front of it. He made the boss's exit not a retreat, but a coronation. He gave away not only his win, but every visible trace that there had even been a contest. That, the journalist said, and he was an old man, and he had seen a great deal, and he was not a man who handed out words like this lightly. That was the most powerful thing he ever watched one human being do to another. Not a punch. Not a threat. A bow given deeper than it was owed, by the man who'd won to the man who'd lost, so that the loser could walk out a king. I was not in that room. I want to say that plainly, because for the next part I'm going to talk like I was, and I owe you the honesty of admitting I wasn't, before I do it. I wasn't there. The journalist was, and the journalist gave it to me, and I've carried it now for years the way he carried it for 40, and somewhere in the carrying it stopped being a story, I was told, and became a room I can stand in. So let me stand in it with you for a second. Let me tell you the next part the way it lives in me, because some things you can only say true from the inside. I can feel that room. I can feel the light still humming, that low electric breath that never stopped, that was there under the whole thing from the first 3 words to the last bow. I can feel 60 people who have not exhaled in what feels like an hour, and has actually been about 2 minutes. I can feel the 4 men along the walls, still loaded, still wired, their bodies still ready for the word that now, they're starting to sense it, is not going to come. And I can feel the exact half-second after the second bow, the small man's deeper one, where the whole room is hanging on the edge of understanding what it just saw, not sure yet whether it's over, not sure yet whether it's safe to be alive. And then the boss turned around. He turned, and he walked out the door he'd come in, back into the late light, unhurried, his face the same stone it had been when he arrived, giving nothing away, a powerful man concluding a brief and dignified visit, and the 4 men along the walls peeled off the walls and went with him, one by one, and the tight readiness went out of their bodies as they moved, and the last one out. The journalist said, the same one whose stillness had gone tight first, the good one, the one whose body had known before his mind, that one looked back. Just once. At the small man. A long look. And the small man met it, calm and easy, and gave him the smallest nod, and the man turned and was gone. And the door was empty. And the lights hummed. And nobody moved. The journalist said the stillness held for a few more seconds even after the door was empty, because nobody could quite believe the danger had walked out of it, The way you don't move right after a near miss on the road, you just sit there gripping the wheel while your body catches up to the fact that you're alive. 60 people gripping the wheel. And then, he said he couldn't tell you who. It wasn't a person, it was the room. The room exhaled. All at once. 60 held breaths going out together, a sound like wind, and with it the noise came back, the shuffles and the murmurs, and somebody's nervous laugh cut short, and somebody else just sitting straight down on the floor where they stood, legs gone, and the young assistant with the clapperboard finally lowering it, the journalist said. Lowering that board he'd been holding up in the air the entire time, his arm shaking so bad by then that the snap of it slipping in his hands was the first sharp sound in the room, like a small gunshot, and half the crew jumped a foot. And the small man? The small man turned around, away from the empty door, and walked back across the concrete to the camera, that same unhurried easy walk, like a man returning from getting a glass of water. And he picked up whatever it was he'd set down. And the journalist swore this, and his eyes were wet when he said it, an old man's eyes by an open window. The small man looked around at his crew, at all those white faces and shaking hands, and the one guy still sitting on the floor, and he gave them the same warm easy smile he'd given the boss. The exact same one. The one that said everything's fine, the one that said I'm glad to see you, the one that had just walked the most dangerous man in Hong Kong out the door without a hand being raised. And he said, and these words the journalist heard, these words carried, these are the only words from the whole afternoon the journalist could give me clean, and so they're the only ones I'll give you. The small man looked at his stunned, shaking crew, and he smiled, and he said, "Let's get the shot." That's it. Let's get the shot. Like nothing had happened. Like it was any Tuesday. And somebody, the assistant director, the journalist thought, somebody made a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob, and then the machine of the thing creaked back into motion, the lights getting checked and the marks getting reset, and the actors finding their places with their hands not quite steady, and the young assistant raised that clapperboard again, raised it for real this time. For the take and not for his life, and he snapped it shut. And the cameras rolled. I want to sit in the quiet after that with you for a minute, because there's a thing about this story that took me a long time to feel all the way. And it's the thing that finally made me understand why the journalist carried it for 40 years instead of just filing it away as a good afternoon's tale. Nothing happened. That's the strangest part. That's the part your mind keeps tripping over. Nobody got hit. Nobody got hurt. There's no body, no blood, no broken bone, no knockout. No moment where the small man does the impossible physical thing. If you describe the actual events to a stranger, a man came in, two men talked quietly, they bowed, the man left, they finished the movie, the stranger would say, "So what?" And he'd be right to, if events were the same thing as meaning, which they are not, which is the whole reason I do this, and not something easier. Because everything happened. Everything that matters happened. In that room, in those 2 minutes, a man with a criminal empire behind him and a man with nothing behind him, but who he decided to be met in the one contest that strips everything else away, and the one with nothing won, and won so completely that he could afford to give the win back, and gave it back so gracefully that the loser walked out a king, and the whole thing looked, to history, like nothing at all. And the cost. Let's talk about the cost, because the small man understood the cost better than anyone, and his whole genius was in what he refused to spend. He didn't spend blood. There was no fight, so nobody bled, so there was no body to answer for, no police, no escalation, no war with an organization he couldn't beat. He didn't spin the boss's face. He built the door, he bowed deeper, he made sure the boss walked out whole. So there was no humiliation for the boss to avenge, no story going around the city that a small man had broken him, no reason for the boss to ever have to come back and erase what happened, because in the only story that traveled, nothing humiliating had happened. The boss had no wound to nurse, and a man with no wound doesn't come back for you. He didn't even spend his own pride, not in the way you think, because his pride was never in being seen to win. That's the thing about him, the deep thing, the thing I keep coming back to. For most men, the win isn't real unless it's witnessed, unless somebody saw them stand on top. The small man didn't need it witnessed. He knew what had happened in that room. The boss knew. That was enough. He could let 60 people believe they'd watched a polite exchange between two big men, could let history record nothing at all, and lose not 1 ounce of anything, because his pride lived inside him where no witness could add to it or take from it. That is a man who has nothing left to prove. And a man who has nothing left to prove is the most dangerous man alive, and the safest man to be around, both at once, and almost nobody ever becomes him. What did it cost, then? What did the small man actually spend, walking across that floor? Just the fear. That's all. The only thing he spent was the fear he refused to feel, or refused to show, because the journalist and I went back and forth on whether a man like that even feels it, and I'll tell you where I landed. I think he felt every bit of it. I think his heart was going just as hard as everyone else's in that room. I think he walked toward that door with the same animal in his chest screaming the same thing it screams at all of us. Don't. This can get you killed. I don't think he was a man without fear. I think he was a man who had simply, completely, decided long ago that the fear didn't get a vote. That it could come along for the walk, could scream the whole way, and he'd walk anyway, smiling, slow, because the question for him was never am I afraid. The question was always only what kind of man am I when it counts, and he'd answered that so many times in so many rooms nobody ever saw that by the time the big room came, the answer walked him across the floor on its own. So that's what happened, bro. That's the whole of it, the events of it, start to finish. 3 words, a smile, a few quiet sentences nobody could fully hear, 2 bows, an empty door, and a man saying let's get the shot. But I promised you at the start that I'd come back at the end and tell you the other thing. The harder thing. The thing I owe you, because you sat through all of this and you trusted me to carry it true. Did it happen? Did it happen the way I just told you, or the way the journalist told me, or did 40 years and an old man's love for a legend sand it smooth and round it up and make it cleaner than the truth ever is? That's the question an honest man has to ask at the end of a story this good, and I'm going to ask it, out loud, and I'm going to tell you what I actually think, no mysticism, straight. And I'm going to tell you the other thing too, the thing about why this works, the real machinery underneath the smile and the bow, the thing you could actually use, the thing that's true whether or not one specific afternoon in Hong Kong went down exactly like the journalist swore it did. So don't go anywhere yet. The story's over. But the part where I tell you what it means, that's just starting. Here's the part nobody expects. You'd think the story of the boss ends at that doorway. He walks out into the late light. He goes back to his city and his streets and his second city underneath the first. And that's that,
A man like him has 100 other rooms to be powerful in, and one quiet afternoon on a film set is nothing, a footnote, forgotten by morning. Except the journalist didn't think it was forgotten. And the reason he didn't think so is the thing that turned this, for me, from a good story into one I had to go find for myself. The journalist kept an eye on that boss for years after. Not on purpose, at first. It was his beat. The man's name came across his desk the way powerful names do, in the careful half-printed way the journalist's whole trade was built on. And he noticed something. He couldn't prove it. He was always careful to say he couldn't prove it. An honest man stays honest even about the stories he loves. But he noticed that in the years after that afternoon, the boss never moved against that production. Never against that studio. Never, as far as the journalist could ever tell, against the small man or anyone close to him. Other productions had trouble. Other studios paid, or bled, or learned their lessons in the second city's particular school. But that one, the one with the small man on it, the second city left it alone. And the journalist had a theory about why, and he gave it to me carefully, as a theory, by the window, and I'll give it to you the same way. He thought the boss had walked out of that room changed. Not soft. Men like the don't go soft. And the journalist was clear he stayed exactly as dangerous to everyone else as he'd ever been. But changed about that man. Because here's the thing the small man had done that the boss could never quite put down. He'd shown the boss respect at the exact moment he had every right to show him contempt. He'd beaten him, and then bowed lower than he had to. And a man who lives his whole life in a world of fear and leverage and contempt, a man who has perhaps never once in his adult life been shown genuine respect by someone who didn't want something from him and didn't fear him, that man, when it finally happens, doesn't forget it. Can't forget it. It lodges in him like a splinter he can't find to pull out. The journalist put it like this, and I've never improved on it. The small man did not make an enemy that day. He made something worse for a man like the boss. He made a debt. And the boss did not know how to carry a debt to a man he could not frighten. So he carried it the only way he knew how, by leaving him alone. Forever. You see what that means, bro? The small man didn't just survive that afternoon. He didn't just save the shoot. With one bow given deeper than it was owed, he bought himself and his people a permanent peace with the second city, not through fear, because you can't outfear a man whose business is fear, but through the one currency the boss had never been paid in and never learned to defend against. Respect freely given by a man who owed him none. That was the only weapon on earth the boss had no answer for. And the small man had spent his whole life learning to wield exactly that. I told you the journalist's eyes were wet when he got to the part about the second bow. I want to tell you why I think they were, because it took me a while to understand it, and when I did it changed how I heard the whole thing. It wasn't the danger that moved him. He'd seen danger his whole life. Danger doesn't make an old reporter cry. It was the waste he'd expected and didn't get. Do you follow me? He'd grown up in that city, in that trade, watching the second city take and take and take, watching good productions fold, watching brave men who stood up get broken, watching the arithmetic come out the same brutal way 10,000 times, because the arithmetic was right, because standing up to that machine got you crushed, and that was simply how the world was. He'd spent 40 years knowing how that story ends. He'd written the careful half-printed version of that ending more times than he could count. And then one afternoon, he watched it end the other way. He watched a man stand up to the machine and not get crushed, and not by being stronger or louder or more violent than the machine, which would have just been a bigger machine, but by being something the machine had no category for. By being dignified at the one man on earth the machine couldn't dignify into submission. He watched the arithmetic come out wrong, the good way wrong, for the first and maybe only time in his life. And he carried that for 40 years, not because it was exciting, but because it was hope. Because it was proof, one single piece of proof he'd witnessed with his own eyes, that the machine could be beaten without becoming the machine. That you could win without the win costing you your soul. That a small man with nothing behind him, but who he decided to be, could walk into the worst room in the city and walk everyone out of it alive, including the monster, by refusing, just refusing, all the way down, to be made small. That's why an old man's eyes go wet by an open window 40 years later. Not for the fear, for the hope. The hope is the heavy thing. The hope is what you carry. He died not long after he told me. I want to say that plainly too, because it matters to me, and because I think it should matter to you. He was the last person alive, as far as I could ever find, who'd stood in that room and watched it with his own eyes. The others were gone. The assistant with the clapperboard, the production manager who'd gone the color of paper, the 60 held breaths, all of them gone now into wherever the witnesses go. The journalist was the last, and he gave it to me at the very end, by the window, with the city coming up from below, and then he was gone too, and now the only place that afternoon lives is in the carrying. So I carry it, and now, having heard it all the way through, the way he made me promise to hear it before he'd tell it, so do you. That's how these things stay alive, bro. Not in records. Not in film. In the carrying, from the one who was there to the one who'll tell it next. You're the next one now. Do me the honor of carrying it true. Now, let me take the storyteller's hat off for a few minutes and put on the other one, the one I wore on the mats for 30 years, the practitioner's hat, the one that doesn't care about hope or beauty and only cares about what actually works and why. Because I owe you the cold version too. Everything I just told you, I told you warm. Now let me tell you cold, no mysticism, straight, the way I'd break it down for a fighter who came to me and asked, how did the small man do that? What's the actual mechanism? Because there is one. It's not magic. You could learn it. Most people won't, but you could. First, the mechanics. The body part. Why the small man stillness beat 5 ready men without a blow. Here's the thing almost nobody understands about a confrontation before it goes physical. The first fight is always a fight over frame, over whose reading of the situation everyone agrees to use. The boss walked in with a frame. I am the danger here, and you will respond to me as the danger. That frame is a thing he projects with his body, his stillness, the 4 men, the silence. And frames are contagious. They only hold if everyone's nervous system agrees to run the same one. 60 people's nervous systems agreed instantly. That's not weakness. That's how human animals work. We sync to the dominant frame in the room because for a few 100,000 years syncing to it kept us alive. The small man did one thing, mechanically, and it was the whole ballgame. He ran a different frame, and he ran it so steadily, with such total physical conviction, the slow walk, the soft eyes, the warm smile, the refusal to check the threats, that his frame, not the boss's, became the one the room couldn't look away from. He didn't fight the boss's frame.
You can't fight a frame head-on. Pushing against it confirms it. He just calmly, physically, ran a stronger one and let the room resync to his. The body language wasn't decoration.
It was the technique. Every relaxed muscle, every unhurried step, every second his eyes stayed soft on the boss and off the bodyguards was a precise mechanical input that said the danger in this room is not what you think it is. And a room full of nervous systems felt that input and started, against their own fear, to believe it.
That's a real skill. That's trainable. We call it different things in different traditions, but it comes down to one capacity: the ability to keep your own nervous system flat when every signal says spike. The fighters who have it can walk into a hot room and cool it. The ones who don't, escalate it just by entering. The small man had it at a level I've seen maybe 2 or 3 times in my life on the mats. The ability to be the calmest nervous system in a room full of fear, and to let that calm spread outward from him until it owned the room. No strike does that. Only that.
So that's the mechanics, the body part, the frame, the contagion of a flat nervous system in a hot room. That's the how of the stillness.
But there's a second piece, and it's the one I actually find more useful, more true, the one I'd want you to walk away with if you only kept one thing. It's the psychology. It's the answer to the question that's probably been sitting in the back of your mind this whole time. The question that's the real engine under every story I tell on this channel.
Why does the big, loud, powerful one break first? Because he does. He did that afternoon, behind that stone face, in that flicker at the corner of his mouth. The most powerful man in the room cracked before the smallest one did, and that's not an accident of this one story. That's a law, bro. It's nearly a physical law, and I've watched it hold true for 30 years in rooms a lot smaller and a lot less dangerous than that one in Hong Kong. Let me tell you why the loud one always breaks first. And then I'll do the last thing I promised. I'll tell you, honestly, straight, how much of the story I just told you I actually believe happened, and how much is the legend rounding up. The hardest question. I'll answer it. Don't go anywhere. We're almost home. Why does the loud one break first? Here's the answer, and it's simpler and harder than people want it to be. The loud man breaks first because his power is borrowed, and borrowed power lives in terror of the lender calling it back. Think about what the boss actually had. He didn't have power the way a mountain has mass. Built in, his own, nothing can take it. He had power the way a king has it, granted moment to moment, by the belief of everyone around him. His whole empire was a shared agreement. The streets feared him because everyone agreed to fear him. The 4 men obeyed him because everyone agreed he was obeyed. Pull the agreement and there's nothing underneath, just a man in a dark suit, same flesh and bone as anyone, who is suddenly outnumbered by all the people who used to be afraid. That's the secret terror inside every man who rules by fear, and they all carry it, every one of them, down where they don't look. The day they stop believing, I'm finished. He'd built his whole life on a foundation that only holds as long as everyone keeps holding it up, and some animal part of him knew, always, every single day, that the foundation was made of nothing but other people's nerves. So watch what the small man's calm actually did to him. The small man didn't attack the boss's power. He did something far worse. He declined to participate in it. He stood in front of the borrowed throne and quietly, pleasantly, without a word of challenge, demonstrated that one human being in the room was not holding it up. And here's the thing about a structure made of belief. The first crack is the only one that matters, because everyone watching is also holding it up, and they're all watching each other. And the moment one person visibly stops, the question rips through the whole room. Wait, do we still have to?
The boss felt that question light up the air. That's what he felt in his gut. Not fear of the small man's fists. Fear that the small man had just shown 60 people the foundation was optional. And a man whose power is borrowed cannot survive the room finding out it was ever optional. That's why he cracked first. He had more to lose, and what he had was more fragile, because it was never really his. Now look at the small man. What did his power rest on? Not on anyone's belief. Not on the 4 men, not on the streets, not on 60 witnesses agreeing to anything. His power rested on a single fact that no one in that room could vote on. He already knew who he was, and nothing in the room could change it. You cannot borrow that, and you cannot be foreclosed on it. It's not granted by the crowd, so the crowd can't revoke it. It's the only kind of power with no lender, which means it's the only kind that never lives in terror. That's why he could be calm. Not because he was brave in some movie way. Because he literally had nothing in that room that could be taken from him. The boss had everything to lose, and it was all on loan. The small man had nothing to lose because the one thing he valued, he carried inside, where the room couldn't reach. And that's the law, bro. That's the whole thing. And it's true in the worst rooms in Hong Kong, and it's true in your office, and your family, and your own head at 3 in the morning. The man whose worth depends on the room will always break before the man whose worth depends on himself. Always. Put them in a quiet room together and just wait. The loud one is loud because he's borrowed. The quiet one is quiet because he isn't. Loudness is the interest payment on borrowed power. And the still ones, the truly still ones, they're still because they don't owe anyone anything for who they are. That's the part I'd keep if you only keep one. Not the bow. Not the smile. That. And now the hard one. The one I promised. I'm not going to dodge it. Did it happen? The way I told it, the way the journalist told me. 3 words, the smile, the trap, the third door, 2 bows, and the deeper one, the empty doorway. Let's get the shot. Did that afternoon go down exactly like that? Here's my honest answer, and I'm going to give it to you straight because you've earned straight. I don't fully know. And neither did the journalist, and he was there. Let me explain that, because it sounds like a dodge, and it isn't. The journalist told me, more than once, that no 2 people who'd been in that room ever told it the same way. I told you that at the very start. Remember, I planted it there on purpose. 1 man remembered more bodyguards. 1 remembered fewer words. 1 swore the small man laughed out loud. Another swore he never made a sound. 1 remembered the boss saying something cruel. Another remembered him saying nothing at all. The clapperboard, the color of the production manager's face, who sat down on the floor. Every witness sanded it a little differently, rounded it toward whatever that afternoon had come to mean for them over the decades they carried it. That's not lying. That's memory. That's what memory does with the moments that matter most. It doesn't store them like film. It retells them, every time, a little smoother, a little truer to the feeling and a little looser on the fact, until the version you got at 80 is a version polished by 60 years of being the most important thing you ever saw. So no, I can't sit here and swear the boss tilted his head exactly 2 inches, or that the small man bowed exactly deeper,
or that those precise words crossed that precise room. The specifics are almost certainly rounded up. The legend almost certainly sanded it smooth. An honest man has to say that, and I'm saying it. But here's what I believe, and I believe it as much as I believe anything I've ever told you. I believe the shape is true. Because the shape is the one thing every version shared, through all the differences, all the polish, all the contradictions. Every single witness kept the same bones. The silence, the small man walking toward the door alone, and nobody getting hit. 60 people who couldn't agree on the details all agreed on the spine. And when contradictory witnesses agree on the spine is usually the realest thing there is. The details are where memory wanders. The spine is what actually happened. And there's a deeper reason I trust it, bro, and it's the reason I'll stand behind this story even knowing the edges are soft. It's true whether or not it happened. Do you understand what I mean by that? The mechanics are real. I've watched a flat nervous system cool a hot room with my own eyes more than once. The psychology is real. I've watched the borrowed power men break before the cell phone men more times than I can count, in rooms a lot less dramatic than that one. The thing this story is about, that real strength doesn't have to raise its hand, that dignity given freely is the one weapon fear can't answer, that the man who already knows who he is can walk through the worst room alive. That's not a legend. That's a law. I've tested it. It holds. The Hong Kong afternoon is just the most beautiful container I've ever found for a truth that's true in 10,000 rooms with no cameras in them at all. So did it happen? Probably, in its bones. Did it happen exactly so? Probably not. Does that change what it's for? Not one bit. The legend is how the truth travels far enough to reach you. The truth is why the legend was worth carrying 40 years by an old man who'd seen everything and chose, at the very end, to spend his last breaths on this one. I'll take that trade. I think you will too. I've spent 30 years around the ring, bro. Around men who hit each other for a living and men who'd hit you for free and men who walked into rooms where the air went thick and had to decide, right then, who they were going to be. And I'll tell you what all those years taught me, the thing that this story holds better than any story I know. The most dangerous man in any room is almost never the loudest. The loud one is doing math, and the math is fear, and fear is borrowed, and borrowed runs out. The dangerous one is the still one, the one whose worth isn't up for a vote, the one who walks slow, who listens all the way through, who looks you in the eye and not at the exits, the one who can beat you and then bow lower than he has to so you can walk out a king. That one. The quiet one with nothing to prove and nothing in the room that can be taken from him. Pray you never have to face him. And if you ever get the chance, spend your whole life trying to become him. Because here's the last thing, the thing the small man understood that the boss never could. The cameras don't matter. The witnesses don't matter. 60 people or 0 people, it changes nothing about who you are when the door goes dark. You don't become who you are in front of the crowd. You become it alone, in all the small rooms nobody sees, 10,000 times, so that when the big room finally comes, the answer's already loaded and it walks you across the floor on its own. The small man set down what he was holding, and he walked toward the door alone. And he could do that, calm, slow, smiling, for one reason and one reason only. He'd already decided who he was. Long before the boss ever darkened that doorway.
That's the whole thing, bro. That's the story. Carry it true. There's a man I keep coming back to in this work. Not the small one from today, but another, from another country, another decade, a man who walked into a room he was supposed to lose and won it the same way, by being the only one in it who wasn't afraid.
They almost crossed paths once, those two. Almost. But that's a different door. I'll open it next time.